You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Wednesday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Go on over there and check out Odyssey Radio. Find out where this show plays on all the different internet outlets, all the terrestrial stations around the country, and check out everything, the show schedule for Odyssey Radio. It's pretty extensive, and there's probably some really interesting stuff there that you're going to want to listen to, if you don't already. And for those of you who have not come over to my YouTube channel, you can watch this broadcast simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel, and that's Mr. Scotty Roberts. When you get there, join up into the live chat room during this broadcast, share your ideas, see what's going on over there, get to know and be a part of the family that's really built up around the show, especially over on the YouTube channel. I know there's thousands of you who listen on the radio. If you have a chance, join the YouTube stream. See what you think. And I want to welcome you all here tonight for a Wednesday night. It's hump day, as they say. Some people hate that commercial. You know, the one I'm talking about with the camel wandering through the office. It's hump day. Hey, Bill, it's hump day. I actually like that. I thought it was a very clever ad when it first came out. The thing's got to be 10 years old now. But it's good stuff. And I enjoy that kind of marketing. So it's hump day. It's the middle of the week. Before Christmas week, what are your plans like for next week? Do you get to take off at the end of this week and have a total away from work next week? Or is it the week after for you between Christmas and New Year's? I know I always worked for a company or companies when I was much younger that said, we're going to be closed that week, but we can't pay you. So it's like a free vacation, but it's unpaid. Then as I got into advertising more and more and into higher echelons of advertising, there was always a paid week off between Christmas and New Year's. So advertising tends to be a little slim in December. So, hey, I'm going to throw out a personal ad. You know I do tarot readings. They're $85 for a 10-card reading, $45 for a 5-card reading. I'm not running any Christmas specials. The only special is you can get yours now if you line up. Go over to my website, scottallenroberts.com. Allen in the middle of that is A-L-A-N. I always have to do that. Or you can look up Scotty Roberts. You'll find my website on Google. scottallenroberts.com. Click on the tarot link toward the top of the page, and you'll see the PayPal buttons there. Just select the reading you want, and then make your payment. Contact me. We'll put it on the schedule. And as I say, advertising, which is my business, illustration, design, the creative side of advertising, that gets pretty bleak during the month of December and sometimes into January, but then it kicks off again. So this is a low time for me. Last quarter is always rough. So if you want to get a reading, this is a time. I've got some time to do it, and I could use the infusion of cash, to be very honest. I'm not going to cover that up. That helps me put bread and butter on the table and keep a roof over our heads. So if you've got the hankering for a tarot reading, come on over, get one. It will benefit us both, I guarantee you. And that's it for advertising me, my stuff. What do they call it? Shameless self-plug. So I pay myself to advertise. Not really. I'm an advertiser on my show. So I want to thank you for being here, listening to everything I have to say, from what I teach to what I do, to the things that I put out there that I market myself with. This is how I maintain doing this show every day. Since we are not paid a salary to do this show, we're paid by advertising. We pay ourselves to do this show, take our own time. Come on over, show your support, get yourself a tarot reading. You can also dig through my website and see other stuff that I do. And that's all I got on that note. You know, Rocky Stucci, I do a show with Rocky Stucci 2 hours after this show starts. It'll be on tonight at 11 p.m. Central Standard Time, midnight Eastern Time. So it's technically our Thursday show because it's Thursday morning out east by the time it airs. And Rocky and I have a pretty good relationship, a pretty good friendship in real life. I'd say he's the closest friend I've gotten in life right now. And he sent me an article last night that was talking about if you know the biblical story of Jesus healing the demoniac of the Gadarenes. If you don't know the story by that name, you remember they're out in the boat, the disciples and Jesus, and there's a storm, and Jesus is sleeping, and they have to wake him up, and all of that's connected to the story. He calms the storm. They put into shore. Everybody's assuming this was the Sea of Galilee, or the Lake Galilee. Gennesaret, I think, is another name for it. And when they put on shore, it says a man from the tombs, known in that area as a demoniac, comes out and confronts him, running out from the tombs, the tomb necropolis, Narthak complex that was there, right at the beach, and Jesus calms him. And this is where Jesus casts the evil spirits out of him. And if you remember the story, Jesus asks the demon within him, who are you? And he says, we are legion, which meaning probably 1,000 demons, and there are multiple demons. And Jesus stills the man who was known for being the madman around the town there that runs amongst the tombs, and he cuts himself with stones, and he'd been chained, but he breaks the chains, and he's running around in his broken chains, and everybody's afraid of him. One of the other Gospels states that there were two of them, the men of the Gadarenes, the two demoniacs. So we're not sure which it is actually in the story, because there's two different versions. Excuse me. But in these versions, Jesus, in both of them, calms the man, casts out the demons. The demons say, where will we go? And Jesus said, there's a herd of pigs. Go into them. And they go into the herd of pigs. And, of course, the pigs go berserk, and the demons run them off the edge of the cliff and into the ocean below, the sea below. Now, it's always been assumed that this took place on the Sea of Galilee. The only problem with this story, and I might do a show on this just because it's fun, and it's interesting to dissect some of these stories, the story never actually says they're on the Sea of Galilee. The new article that Rocky had sent me said they found a stone marker that said this is the place where Jesus cast the demons out of the demoniac of the Gadarenes. Yet that stone marker was put up in the 5th century, about 500 years later than the event. Now, does that mean they're marking the actual place it took place, or the traditional place it took place? I like to watch a show I started 20 years ago, watching a show called The Naked Archaeologist with Szymka Jakubowiczy. Now, if you have never seen that show, great stuff. He's a Jewish man. He lives in Jerusalem. He has done a very tongue-in-cheek sometimes show, but it's very serious at the same time, about biblical topics, biblical archaeology, and he dissects them down. And he has a lot of fun doing the show. If you can find that show anywhere, great to watch. You can go on YouTube and look up Szymka Jakubowiczy documentaries, and you can see his stuff. But he did a little thing on the maniac, or the demoniac of the Gadarenes. And he said the first thing you have to look for is, number one, did this take place on the Sea of Galilee, which is a big lake. You can see the other side, when you're standing on one of the shores. And it says that they set out from Capernaum heading toward the other side of the lake. And a big storm hit. And a storm so bad the boat was going to capsize, but Jesus was sleeping in the boat. And so they went and they woke him up. And he says, "Don't you have any faith in me at all?" And he calms the storm. As the story goes, they all thought they were going to die. And then they set in on the other side of the lake. They pull up on shore, and this is where Jesus is confronted with the demoniac. Now, the interesting thing about this story is, first of all, the kind of boats they used back then. The fishing boats. They've excavated some of these boats, and the biggest ones of them all are not much bigger than huge rowboats. There's no cabin in them. And they say Jesus was sleeping in that while a storm hit. Probably when you got 12 guys with you in that boat, there's not a lot of room for sleeping. And if a big storm hit, there's not a lot of room for survival, or at least not capsizing. Another interesting thing is that the Sea of Galilee doesn't have tumultuous storms. They can get winds that come off the lake, and they can have wavy lake and so on, but they don't have storms like is depicted in the story, where the boat's going to capsize and everybody's going to die. So the first question came in is, did this story take place on the Sea of Galilee or not? Or were they going somewhere else? Were they on a bigger body of water? And then the next thing you have to look at in this story is where the Gadarenes actually lay. Physically, there are 3 candidates of towns, of landings on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee that could be the Gadarenes. And they're all traditionally held to as being the spot, one better than the other because it's more remote. Now the first thing you have to look for is, are there the cliffs that they talked about, where the pigs ran off the cliffs and died in the waters below? How close are the cliffs to the water? Then you have to, and that's even assuming for possible changes in the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee, which are not vast. There hasn't been a lot of change in that region. And so you look for that. And then you look for the necropolis, the tombs. And these 3 locations definitely have tombs in them. And then you have to look for all the key geological landmarks that match up with the story. And Szymka Jakubowicz takes us through all 3 of those in his little documentary. And the problem is that the first 2 of those sites, they don't bear a historical name of Gadara or the Gadarenes. The cliffs are there, but in one of the first locations, they're set way back, a good half a mile off of the sea, and it's really slopes as opposed to sharp cliffs. The second city is the same. Little sharper cliffs, but set back too far from the ocean. And both of these places have tombs, but not vast necropolises. And then you go to the third location, which actually bears the name of Gadara, but we don't know if that was its traditional name at the time, or it was named that afterwards. But they're a good, 6 kilometers? They're 6 kilometers off the shore. And so for the pigs to run off the edge of the sharp cliff and tumble down into the waters below and die, they're 6 kilometers removed, which I always thought of the kilometers being roughly the equivalent in the metric of a mile, so I think it's less than a mile. Excuse me. So they're a few miles off of the waters, and there's not a vast necropolis there. So you start looking at the traditional sites that could have been aligned up with this event, this story, and you find there's nothing on the Sea of Galilee that remotely matches the story, although you can say there are some that kinda match. Now the theory is this. Perhaps Jesus mounted a boat with his disciples. It was a little bigger boat, had a place for him to sleep, and they encountered storms, but they were out on the Mediterranean, which, of course, on the eastern coast of Israel, you have port cities there where you can get a boat and cross the Mediterranean. And this was not, we've got to stop thinking in this enclosed little cube of the biblical people like they didn't travel anywhere. Well, according to this, Jesus wanted to go to the Gadarenes. And where is the Gadarenes located? There's a city called Gadara in Spain, near the Gibraltar Straits. And on the one side, the north, if you look at it the way you're looking at me, it would be over Gibraltar is here, the Mediterranean, and over here, the Gadarenes would be through the Straits of Gibraltar in a small island now. But at the stormy parts would be the rocky cliffs, which are notorious for the centuries for storms just before you get to the Straits of Gibraltar. And it's on the southern shore of Spain, southwestern shore of Spain, if you will. And what is there? But you make a landing there where these sharp rocky cliffs that fall into the waters. There you find a vast ancient necropolis. And there is also, in this little town of Gadara, there is a community of Christians that hail their origins all the way back to the time of Jesus, saying that there's a legend that Jesus had visited their town. And they even have a relic. It's supposed to be a footprint that was cast that Jesus made when he landed there. And a lot of the believers that are there have a different mode of Christianity. And it's one that's based on the fact that their families have believed since the day that Jesus set foot there and made himself known to them. And so there's an interesting story that's different from the biblical story. It tells the same tale, but at the same time as telling the tale, it's really keeping true to the facts as you see in the story in the Bible. It's just not the Sea of Galilee. And there's nothing hugely theological about that either way. So it's a very interesting story when you start digging into it. Maybe we'll look into that in some depth a little later on. But it's worth looking at. And now what it brings up in my mind, back when I was in church work, I did a lot of music in the church when I worked with the youth. And there was a song that I did in the church, and I played it on guitar. It was written by a guy named Bob Bennett. And it was a fantastic song about this event. It was called Man of the Tombs. And while my theology doesn't match up so much in every point anymore to this, these are the lyrics of that song, and I thought it was really worth mentioning here in a connection to that story. He said, Man of the tombs, he lives in a place where no one goes, and he tears at himself and lives with a pain that no one knows. He counts himself dead among the living. He knows no mercy and no forgiving. Deep in the night, he's driven to cry out loud. Can you hear him cry out loud? Man of the tombs, possessed by an unseen enemy, he breaks every chain and mistakes his freedom for being free. Shame and shamelessness equally there, like a random toss of a coin in the air. Man of the tombs, he's driven to cry out loud. Underneath this thing that I've become, a fading memory of flesh and blood. I curse the womb, I bless the grave. I've lost my heart, I can't be saved. Like those who fear me, I'm afraid. Like those I've hurt, I can feel pain. Naked now before my sin, and these stones that cut against my skin. Some try to touch me, but no one can. For man of the tombs I am. Do you ever feel that way about yourself? Man of the tombs, woman of the tombs, person of the tombs. Song goes on. Down at the shoreline, down at the shoreline, two sets of footprints meet. One voice is screaming, the other voice begins to speak. In only a moment and only a word, the evil departs like a thundering herd. Man of the tombs, he hears this cry out loud. Underneath this thing that you've become, I see a man of flesh and blood. I give you life beyond the grave. I heal your heart. I come to save. No need to fear. Be not afraid. This man of sorrows knows your pain. I come to take away your sin and bear its marks upon my skin. When no one can touch you, still I can, for Son of God I am. Now again, you don't have to agree with the theology on this, but look at the message. Song goes on. Dressed now and seated, clean in spirit and healthy of mind, man of the tombs, he begs to follow, but must stay behind. He'll return to his family with stories to tell of mercy and madness, of heaven and hell. Man of the tombs, soon he will cry out loud, Underneath this thing that I once was, now I'm a man of flesh and blood. I have a life beyond the grave. I found my heart. I can now be saved. No need to fear, I'm not afraid. This man of sorrows took my pain. He comes to take away my skin and bear its marks upon his skin. I'm telling you this story because, man of the tombs, I was. So, I'm amazed sometimes at the deep emotion that is still connected to a lot of this stuff for me. It's because while I look to study and research and find the facts about these things, I still have a place in my heart for it. And this is why I tell people, I don't ask you to change what you believe. I don't ask you to follow the road I've followed. I ask you to examine what you say you believe. And the message you can take from that song, which had a different meaning for me back when I was in evangelical church ministry, you can take that song, you can ask yourselves, how many of us here, male or female, are a man of the tombs, a person of the tombs, that we're lost in our own sadness, in our own pain. Some try to touch you, but no one can, for man of the tombs you are. So look at this and look for the redemption of that. Look for the friends that are here. Look to your faith, whatever it may be, and find that there is nothing that can hold us down, nothing that can keep power over us that we do not allow to have power over us. So as that song closed, he says, man of the tombs I was. And so ask yourself, where are you? And you know what? That little story, that song, it took up the whole first half. We're going to go get back into things that we left off with yesterday in just a few minutes. Probably 2 minutes or less. So 2 minutes from now, I'll see you right back here. And hang tight, sit tight. All right, folks, thanks for sitting tight through the break. We're back. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you can come and join us over on my YouTube channel for the simulcast of this show in video. And that's over on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And you, of course, as I say every night, you can come and join us in the live chat room there, meet some of the members of the Intrepid family, and enjoy the chat. In the live chat, you can have input to this show as we're doing it. You can just come and talk to talk. Come and meet us all over there. And that's alongside the Odyssey audio broadcast of this show. All right, we're going to try to get back into it here with where we left off on this whole development thing. And I hope I have time now, since I took the whole first half of the show to go through a totally different story. We left off yesterday talking about the spiral, and talking about the spiral, the developmental spiral. And we had color-coded them, even though I had the black and white picture. And somebody suggested maybe I have my little daughter come in and color it for me and then repost it. I haven't done that since last night. So I'm not going to show the spiral again. But talking about these colors, these stages of development. And we kind of left off talking about how Wilbur, one of the people who developed this, has divided his previous developmental stages into a space that he called vision logic, and into two levels, low vision logic and high vision logic. And this is kind of where we left off last night. And the view of self expands at the very top as you reach the top of this spiral to embrace paradigms, to this ability to see the system as a whole. So you can look back through the spiral, the funnel, if you will, that spirals down to the earliest stages. And this is spaces at home with yellow's strengths. Remember, we said yellow is a step above where it kind of separates itself and is able to look back in. And it's comfortable with paradox. It has a high level of tolerance for differing belief systems. And so the next color on the scale is going to be turquoise. And that's the final color on the spiral, the top, if you will. And it's kind of called this global view stage. This turquoise digs deeper into the self. It discovers what its subconscious aspects can be used for, and tapped as readily as its conscious aspects. So you have the ability to see things on a conscious level, but tap into the subconscious, or the unconscious, if you will, below the consciousness level. And this opens up even more possibilities for ideas and solutions to problems. This turquoise stage values instinct. It values intuition equally with the intellect. So intellect, instinct, intuition, the three I's. Again, intellect, instinct, and intuition. It can sense this underlying order and the interconnectedness in the grand scheme of things that's before us in our lives. Its interest lies with dynamics that affect the Earth as a whole, not just the planet, the Earth, everything on it as a whole. This interconnectivity, this universal interconnectivity, its interest lies with the dynamics of that and with the macro level decisions and actions. This turquoise stage believes that no one can ever know and understand everything, and that reality can only be experienced, not known. So you can't know reality. You don't perceive reality in a certain way. Well, I take that back. You can perceive reality in a different way, but perception is not fact. Perception is not truth. It's like my old illustration of the grand old theaters of the old day, where you sit in the red velvet seat to watch the play on stage. Everybody in that auditorium has a different perspective on what is actually happening on stage. What happens on stage doesn't change, but perception can. So you don't need to know and understand everything, and you can't know and understand everything. Turquoise space is still emergent. It's emerging. It's in that process for you when you get there. And so you don't yet know all of its characteristics. They put the percentage of turquoise in the world at about 0.1% of the world's population. And it holds its power at about 1%. And so this level of high vision logic, or the higher mind, if you will, states that it operates from a global perspective, one that's like outside, almost outside your body, outside experience, looking back in. And this is beyond a planetary perspective, in that it includes in its moral span a concern for all things, for all beings, for all life on the globe. Now, I'm not talking about weird green dealism. I'm not talking about save the planet stuff. That's not what this is about. It just sees things from a more global perspective, not just a human life perspective. And the individual isn't only able to sense and operate within paradigms as a whole, but can now function kind of paradigmatically, if that's a word, balancing seeming opposites and paradox with ease. There's a balance that comes. It's like the star card in the tarot, where it shows the woman pouring out two vessels, water out of each, but passing between the two. Water stands for balance, and she's pouring balance between equally opposing vessels and keeping the balance. And that's really what this is about. It's balancing the seeming opposites in the world with ease, balancing paradoxes with ease. And it's at this point that the spiral ends. The nature of the spiral is such that new capacities continue to open as humans grow into them. And they've reserved a space for the next level of the spiral, which they call coral. C-O-R-A-L. But they don't know what this level will become once it emerges. We don't know yet. Wilbur had assigned these colors to his developmental stages, some of which align to the spiral and some of which don't. For purposes of consistency, I've used the spiral's colors to this point, but since the spiral ends and Wilbur's spaces continue on, you have to shift to his colors now. Let's move a little bit beyond the spiral now. There is the transpersonal stages above the turquoise, which was the highest level of this developmental spiral, which started at basic needs, survival, food, nutrition, worked into understanding, awareness, worked into all these things all the way through, worked into dogma and opinionated stances on life, taking specific stances on things. Then it moved from there on to being beyond that and saying a specific stance isn't necessary. Then viewing the whole as viewing back through all the stages as a whole, and then going beyond that and becoming more transcendental almost, taking this global view, an intuitive view. And this is all things that go on in the human heart, but many people just stop at a certain point and they don't go beyond that. So now the transpersonal stages, these are from, remember, all these stages are from archaic to high vision logic. These are personal spaces because they're centered in the individual and has his or her sense of self. And the spaces that Wilbur calls transpersonal, shift to a focus on the self as part of a non-physical or a spiritual world. We are set apart from that. You've got to look at the role that the individual plays in a non-physical, in a spiritual world. These spaces are the psychic, the subtle, the casual, the non-dual, but it now represents these four states of consciousness, not so much as stages of consciousness. They're states of consciousness, not stages. And this new transpersonal stage is called the illuminated mind stage, the intuitive mind, the overmind, the supermind. And in these stages, the self moves away from nourishment for the mind and toward nourishment for the soul, which includes things as meditation, contemplation, visions, the union with the divine. It assigns the color indigo, dark blue, so maybe that's assigned because of the whole indigo children thing and the significance of indigo, to the level of the illuminated mind, whose moral span is transglobal. The color violet to the end of the intuitive mind. And the third transpersonal level is the overmind, to which he assigns the color of ultraviolet. And finally, the supermind, to which he assigns clear light. So now these are just man-made principles and levels of understanding to go through and understand these different levels. There's not many more in-depth descriptions of these stages by Wilbur. He kind of left off at a certain point. And although in previous writing he equates the highest levels of development with the self coming to the realization that nothing exists that is not energy or spirit. So the self begins to let go of all forms it's adopted for spirit, from nature to deity to archetype, and becomes much more formless. The self sees that it's directly connected to spirit and has access to all of the consciousness at all times. Could you imagine having a mind like that, where you've transcended the mind and you see everything and understand everything? It also realizes it has always had this direct connection. And so it comes to an appreciation that every point in development is perfectly adequate for embracing spirit. Not finding anything to the contrary, you've got to assume for now that this view of higher development for the transpersonal stages remains in effect. And it moves into states of consciousness. The prior categories that were established by Wilbur of psychic, subtle, casual, non-dual, they continue on, but as states, not as stages of development. These are states of development. States describe a certain type of experience within a given stage, like a peak experience within a given stage. It opens itself to particular encounter with the universe as a whole. That's a pretty lofty place to be, I'd think. Now, you might be able to think really hard and identify people that you think have attained this state. I find I'm hard-pressed to find that. But this is a capability that everybody can possess and already do to some extent, whether they developed into the state as opposed to the stage. And these experiences are transient. They're not permanent. It's associated with the psychic state, with experiences in which the self feels at one with all of nature or the physical world around them. How many psychics do you know who constantly wander and are in a psychic trance state? So it's like that. It's temporary. It's transient. The subtle state is related to dream states, which a person might enter while daydreaming or doing meditations that require visualization. They're compared to the casual or the formless state to dreamless sleep and spiritual experiences involving vastness and emptiness. There's a witnessing state in which the self is able to observe itself and other states to dream lucidly. You ever had a lucid dream where you're kind of in control of what you're seeing and what you're doing? The non-dual state is one, and by the way, in a lucid dream, I'm not talking about that you're dreaming about yourself having control over what's happening, but that you're lucid, you're almost awake within your dream, and you're able to say, this is what I want to see, and this is what I want this to do. The non-dual state is one in which the self is present to the source, and it grounds all of the other states. People might have such experiences no matter what stage of development that they find themselves in, or what turn of the spiral they may be at presently, what color code they can assign to themselves, where they occupy, although they'll interpret their experiences according to the value system they hold. So if you, let's say you are one of those, you're on that green stage where of the spiral development, where everything is dogmatic, and you have to take a certain stance on things. You might be able to have this transcendental experience, yet at the same time it's going to fall inside what you occupy. And so the idea is to try to find ways to develop beyond that. So, in other words, a person in a red space and a person in a green one can both have psychic experiences, but they're going to interpret them differently because of their developmental capacities. So maybe a good thing to ask yourself is take a little time, meditate a little bit, think about it openly. Which colors of the spiral or which of these developmental spaces do you believe you occupy? And where are you now? Identify significant events that happened while you were in each space. Look at the beliefs you've identified in your life along the way. Do you associate any of them with particular capacities of development? I believe this is so because I've only been able to reach that far in development. And when you transitioned from one to the next, what happened to bring on the transition? What can you identify? Were there defining moments in your life that you can hail to? Was it easy? Or was it difficult? I've had difficulty in transitioning from one stage to the next, so I know what that's like. Maybe you do too. Were you a man of the tombs that has evolved beyond that stage? Which value clusters or developmental spaces do you feel comfortable with? And why? And what makes you uncomfortable? And why? So make a list of all the people that you're close to or who you interact with regularly. What value clusters do they tend to act from? And do they shift depending on what they're doing? Such as being with family, playing sports, going to work, to church, etc. All these things I've talked about ad infinitum, the things that absorb our daily lives. Do you tend to navigate or balance more on one level of the spiral in your life? How does this make you feel? If you can identify that I'm kind of just revolving around this one segment in the spiral. What does healthy development look like to you? What does it mean to you to go beyond that? What things might help people to grow healthily? Pick a level of the spiral. Brainstorm on it for yourself. What would it look like to you? How might society aid in encouraging healthy development and transitions? How might religion? Take a look at religion nowadays. Take a look at politics and government nowadays, not just in America, but at different places around the world. How do those affect who you are? So that brings us to this developmental picture. And we've really only got about 5 or 6 minutes left here. And so we're going to start digging into this a little bit, because sometimes I and many other people I know wonder why we spend time discussing development when it's not really encountered in spiritual or interfaith discussions. We disagree, as we believe that developmental issues are present at every discussion of spirituality, whether or not they're openly acknowledged. Why? Because those in the discussion bring their developmental perspectives with them. It's part of who they are. And they speak directly from within those. Developmental perspective shapes spiritual worldview. So where you are developmentally is going to shape your worldview. So whether the connection between a person's development and their worldview is obvious or maybe not so obvious, it doesn't make the connection less real. This goes for me. This goes for you. This goes for everybody we encounter. You need to look no further than the current world events to know how real the effects of spiritual worldviews can be. Look at the current political events in the world. Look at the way the world is operating. Where do you suppose most of the world is on that developmental scale? What is the world's developmental capacity? If you look at somebody who's stuck in making this world what it is right now, the thing it's become, could you honestly look at them and say, I think that person's stuck in their developmental capacity? I certainly think that. I sometimes think I'm stuck in certain developmental capacities. How can those interested in interspirituality afford not to educate themselves on these issues? How can you afford to not educate yourself on these issues? Ignorance is not a viable option. And like I've said already in this series, once you start to know some of these things are so, be it on a developmental stage, be it on a historical aspect of early Christianity that we've studied, or paganism, or whatever, all of these things, once you know things, you have no excuse for ignorance, no excuse for not taking personal action. And nobody out there on the developmental cycle is excused for ignorance because it's there to see. So that's the reasons I believe understanding this developmental spiral, understanding development essentially, is incredibly important. Models of development such as the spiral dynamics, Wilber's spaces that we talked about, his color codes, explain how people's beliefs and values come together to create an interior capacity that holds a certain way of being in the world. And some of these ways tend to support interspirituality and mutual cooperation, while others don't at all. So this is giving you a complete picture. Well, as complete as I possibly can anyway. First, because I think you're entitled to all of this knowledge. You care to gain it. And second, because if we skip over what the interior landscape is all built over, what it's all about, the foundation for understanding the rest is going to be missing. So you've got to understand the developmental capacities we all have. The developmental models can feel artificial because we label them, we put color codes to them. It's artificial and unconnected to some of us. And it's unconnected to real life. It seems like a diagram. While it's presented in color, we understand it in black and white, so to speak. So social scientists look to growth and development from the outside. While you and I and every one of us experience it from the inside. And the insiders don't necessarily feel like the outsides look. So these are very different perspectives. It's like me on certain things that I've chosen to believe. The insides don't always coincide with the outside. There's sometimes a lot of conflict. So in observing this growth from a vantage point from outside the box, your personal experiences offer you and me a view of the entire inner landscape, regardless of whether or not we've already traveled there ourselves. So, some of us who are uncomfortable with these models, we are so because they present growth as a progression from one level to the next in a ladder-like fashion, despite the image of the spiral. When again, growth doesn't necessarily feel that way when experienced. Due to the holonic nature of development, it's legitimate to describe growth in a progressive manner. Growth comes as we progress. It's like physically, in the physical state. Do you notice you are growing from infant to baby to toddler to child to young adult to adulthood to old elderly? Do we notice those things as they're happening? No. We sometimes later look in the mirror and go, whoa, I've changed over the last few years. So we notice the outside. The inside, it's something that just happens. Progression happens. It's natural. With the new layers that are building on those that came before. And this isn't the only way to describe growth, obviously. But it's a legitimate way. It can also be difficult to describe a holon without setting up levels that move from one to the next. If you doubt this, try describing a holon from its outside and see how your description looks on paper. So understanding developmental capacities as containers of value can help us all appreciate the worldview of ourselves, of any given person or any given group, and how they might behave in a given circumstance. It can also help us understand the developmental how and why of those who are attracted to interfaith work, and the how and why of those who are vehemently opposed to it. So with this in mind, we're going to go look at some faith development and look more closely at growth in the context of spirituality, which is kind of where we left off before all of that. But not tonight. We're done. Thanks for being here. That's the end of the program tonight. I'm going to take a 23-hour break. Be back tomorrow. You be here tomorrow, too. We'll pick this up where we left off. Great having you here. Have a good night.